Misogynist man insults female CEO, then learns she built the company from scratch. Dan Harris had always been confident. Too confident, some might say. As a senior manager at a high-profile tech company, he prided himself on his ability to make deals, lead teams, and charm clients. But there was another side to him, one less appealing. Dan had a habit of underestimating women in the workplace. To him, they were often soft, emotional, or simply lucky if they succeeded. That morning, Dan arrived at the company's downtown headquarters feeling particularly smug. He had just finalized a lucrative partnership deal, and the adrenaline of his success had him walking taller than usual. As he stepped into the elevator, his team buzzed around him, congratulating him and feeding his ego. Another win for the Harris team, he declared as the elevator doors closed. His junior associate, Matt, nodded enthusiastically. "You're unstoppable." The team exited the elevator and made their way to the conference room for the weekly executive meeting. The room buzzed with energy as senior leaders discussed upcoming projects and quarterly goals. Dan casually leaned back in his chair, barely paying attention, until the door opened and she walked in. Emma Caldwell, the company's CEO, entered the room with her usual poise and confidence. Her tailored suit and sharp gaze commanded attention. The room quieted immediately, a testament to the respect she had earned. But not from Dan. He glanced at her with mild disinterest, turning his focus back to his phone. To him, Emma was just another executive who had gotten lucky in her career, a figurehead who attended meetings and collected accolades but didn't do the real work. Emma took her seat at the head of the table and began the meeting. "Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. We have some exciting updates and important decisions to make today." As she spoke, her leadership was evident. Emma asked incisive questions, challenged assumptions, and encouraged collaboration. Yet Dan couldn't help but feel irritated. He saw her as someone who talked a good game but relied on others to execute. When the conversation shifted to Dan's recent deal, he seized the opportunity to shine. "It's a game changer," he said, puffing out his chest. "Our team delivered big this time. It'll boost our numbers significantly." Emma nodded, reviewing the proposal on her tablet. "It's an impressive deal," she said, "but I have some concerns about the long-term implications for our smaller clients. We need to ensure this doesn't create imbalances in our portfolio." Dan scoffed quietly, just loud enough for a few people to notice. "Imbalances? With all due respect, Emma, that's not how this industry works. Sometimes you have to make bold moves and worry about the details later." The room went silent. Emma looked up from her tablet, her expression calm but firm. "Bold moves are important, Dan, but so is foresight. Our success isn't just about winning big deals, it's about sustainability and trust." Dan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." After the meeting, Dan's frustration bubbled over. He vented to Matt as they walked back to their office. "Can you believe her? Acting like she knows better than me. I've been in this game longer than she has." Matt hesitated. "Well, she is the Yeah, and I'd love to know how she got there," Dan muttered. "Probably some diversity quota or a lucky break. There's no way she built this company herself." Matt didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Unbeknownst to Dan, his words had caught the attention of Sarah, a marketing director who had overheard the conversation. Sarah had been with the company for years, and she deeply admired Emma. She decided it was time for Dan to learn the truth. That afternoon, Sarah approached Dan's office with a file folder. "Hey Dan," she said casually. "Got a minute?" Dan looked up, surprised. "Sure, what's up?" "I thought you might find this interesting," Sarah said, placing the folder on his desk. "It's the company's history. You know, how it all started." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Why would I need to know that?" Sarah smiled knowingly. "Just thought it might give you some perspective." Dan shrugged, opening the folder as Sarah walked away. Inside was a collection of articles, photographs, and documents detailing the company's origins. As he began to read, his smirk slowly faded. The story was incredible. Emma Caldwell had founded the company 15 years ago, starting with nothing but an idea and a small loan. She had faced countless challenges, rejections from investors, skepticism from competitors, and financial struggles that nearly forced her to shut down. But she had persevered, driven by her vision of creating innovative solutions for underserved markets. The articles highlighted her ingenuity and resilience. Emma had not only built the company from scratch but had also steered it through turbulent times, including an economic downturn that had shuttered many of her competitors. Her leadership had transformed the company into a global powerhouse, earning her widespread respect and recognition. Dan stared at the documents, his mind racing. He had always assumed Emma was a figurehead, a leader who had inherited success rather than created it. But the evidence before him painted a very different picture. The next day, Dan arrived at work feeling uneasy. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a sense of humility he wasn't used to. He found himself replaying his dismissive remarks in the conference room and cringing at his arrogance. When the weekly leadership meeting rolled around, Dan sat quietly, listening more intently than usual. As Emma spoke, he noticed nuances in her leadership style that he had overlooked before: her ability to connect ideas, her willingness to listen, and her knack for asking the right questions. At the end of the meeting, Dan lingered as the others filed out. Summoning his courage, he approached Emma. "Emma," he began awkwardly. "Can I have a minute?" She looked up from her tablet, her expression neutral. "Of course, Dan. What's on your mind?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. I've been dismissive, arrogant, and honestly, I underestimated you. I didn't understand everything you've done to build this company. I was wrong." Emma studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you, Dan," she said finally. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. And for the record, I've always believed in bold moves. But they're most effective when backed by respect and collaboration." Dan nodded, her words sinking in. "I have a lot to learn." "We all do," Emma said with a small smile. "The important thing is that we're willing to grow." From that day on, Dan approached his work with a new mindset. He listened more, collaborated more, and let go of the biases that had clouded his judgment. And though it took time, he earned Emma's respect, not by trying to prove himself, but by showing that he was willing to change. For Dan, the experience was humbling, but it was also transformative. He had come to realize that true leadership wasn't about ego or control. It was about vision, resilience, and the ability to inspire others. And in Emma Caldwell, he had found a leader worth following. Dan's apology marked the beginning of a transformation, not just in how he approached his work, but in how he viewed leadership, success, and the people around him. It wasn't an overnight change, but day by day he began dismantling the biases and assumptions that had shaped his behavior for so long. Emma noticed the difference. While she wasn't one to hold grudges, she had been skeptical of Dan's sincerity at first. But as weeks turned into months, his actions spoke louder than his words. He sought input from team members he had previously dismissed, showed humility in admitting mistakes, and even started mentoring junior employees with a newfound sense of patience and empathy. One afternoon, Emma invited Dan to her office. He was nervous, old habits of self-doubt creeping back as he tried to guess the purpose of the meeting. "You wanted to see me?" he asked as he stepped inside. Emma looked up from her laptop and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Stan, have a seat." He complied, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I've been watching you," Emma began, her tone neutral but warm. "And I've noticed a significant change in how you approach your work. I want you to know I appreciate the effort you've been putting in, not just in your performance but in how you treat the people around you." Dan felt a wave of relief and gratitude but didn't quite know how to respond. "Thank you, Emma. That means a lot coming from you." She nodded. "It's clear you're capable of growth, and that's not something everyone is willing to do. Which is why I'd like to ask for your input on a new project we're launching." Dan blinked, surprised. "You want my input?" "Yes," she said simply. "We're developing a mentorship initiative to support women in leadership roles across the company. Given your experience and the perspective you've gained recently, I think you could contribute something valuable." Dan was taken aback. The old version of himself might have balked at the idea, viewing it as an unnecessary focus on diversity rather than merit. But now, he saw it for what it was, an opportunity to empower others and challenge outdated structures. "I'd be honored," he said sincerely. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Emma smiled. "Good. Let's make it happen." The mentorship initiative became a turning point for Dan. Working closely with Emma and a diverse group of colleagues, he gained a deeper understanding of the barriers women faced in the workplace, barriers he had previously been blind to or, worse, contributed to. Hearing their stories humbled him, and he became an advocate for change within the company. One of the men's in the program was a young analyst named Priya. Bright, ambitious, and full of ideas, Priya reminded Dan of himself when he was starting out. But unlike him, she faced constant scrutiny and doubt from her peers, her ideas dismissed or credited to others in meetings. Dan took her under his wing, encouraging her to speak up and ensuring her contributions were acknowledged. Over time, Priya blossomed, gaining the confidence to lead projects and present her ideas directly to senior leadership. During one meeting, as Priya delivered a pitch that left the room in awe, Dan caught Emma's eye. She nodded subtly, a silent acknowledgement of the growth they had both witnessed. As Dan became more involved in the mentorship initiative, he found himself reflecting on the assumptions and biases he had carried for so long. He thought about his late father, a strict and traditional man who had drilled into him the idea that strength and success were tied to dominance and control. For years, Dan had equated leadership with power. But Emma, and the women he worked with, had shown him another way. Leadership could be collaborative, empathetic, and inclusive. And it was no less powerful. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling day at work, Dan sat down to write an email to Emma. It wasn't about a project or a report, it was personal. Subject: "Thank you. Hi Emma. I've been meaning to write this for a while, but I wanted to take a moment to express my gratitude. Working with you has changed the way I see not just this company, but myself. You've shown me what real leadership looks like, and I realize now how much I still have to learn. I know I've made mistakes, many of them, but you've given me the chance to grow, and I don't take that for granted. Thank you for challenging me, for believing in me, and for setting an example I aspire to follow. Sincerely, Dan." Emma read the email late that night, sitting in her quiet home office. She smiled, her heart warmed by his words. She didn't respond immediately, she wanted to think about what she would say. But in that moment, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why she had built the company, to create not just products and profits, but people and possibilities. As the mentorship initiative expanded, it began to attract attention from outside the company. Industry leaders and media outlets praised the program as a model for fostering diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Emma and Dan were invited to speak at conferences, sharing their insights and experiences. During one such event, Dan stood at the podium, looking out at a packed auditorium. Emma sat in the front row, watching as he took a deep breath and began. "When I started my career, I thought I knew everything. I thought success was about being the loudest voice in the room, the one who made the big decisions and closed the big deals. But I was wrong. I've learned that real leadership isn't about ego, it's about listening, learning, and lifting others up. And I owe that lesson to Emma Caldwell. She built this company from scratch, facing challenges I can't even imagine. And she did it with grace, strength, and a vision that continues to inspire me every day." The audience erupted into applause, but Dan wasn't finished. "I'm proud to work for a company that values growth, not just financial growth, but personal growth. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of something bigger than myself." As he stepped down from the stage, Emma stood to greet him. "That was beautifully said," she told him. "Thank you," Dan replied. "For everything." The years that followed were some of the most transformative in Dan's life. He became a champion for inclusion and mentorship, both within the company and beyond. His journey of growth and redemption inspired others to confront their own biases and strive for better. Emma, meanwhile, continued to lead with vision and determination, always staying true to the principles that had guided her from the start. Together, she and Dan proved that change was possible, not just for individuals, but for entire organizations. And as they stood side by side at the company's 20th anniversary celebration, surrounded by colleagues, friends, and family, they reflected on the journey that had brought them there. It was a journey of mistakes and lessons, challenges and triumphs. But most of all, it was a journey of transformation, and the belief that even the most unlikely people could grow into the leaders the world needed. The transformation Dan had undergone over the years didn't just ripple outward to those around him. It also led to a deeper reflection of his own values and purpose. The mentorship program continued to flourish under his guidance, and he became one of the key figures in fostering a culture of inclusivity within the company. But as he poured himself into this new role, he began to realize how much of his life had been spent chasing superficial success, neglecting the things that truly mattered. One Friday evening, after a long day of meetings, Dan found himself lingering in the office. The usual bustle had quieted, and the glow of the city lights filtered through the tall windows. He looked at the framed photo on his desk, a picture of himself with his late father, taken years ago at a golf course. For much of his life, his father's approval had been his driving force, shaping his ambition and his view of the world. But now, as he sat alone in the dim office, Dan wondered what his father would think of him today. Would he be proud of the man he had become? Or would he see the shift in his values as a sign of weakness? These thoughts weighed heavily on Dan's mind as he left the building and walked to a nearby park. The cool evening air was refreshing, and the sound of children laughing in the distance brought a small smile to his face. He sat on a bench, staring at the city skyline, and let his mind wander. The next week, Emma called an all-hands meeting to announce a major milestone for the company. After years of steady growth and innovation, they had reached a record-breaking level of revenue and impact. The announcement was met with thunderous applause, but Emma quickly shifted the focus back to the people who had made it all possible. "This success belongs to all of you," she said, her voice steady but warm. "It's a testament to the hard work, creativity, and collaboration that define this company. But it's also a reminder that we have a responsibility to continue pushing boundaries, to uplift others, and to lead with purpose." Dan watched from his seat, admiring the way Emma commanded the room. He thought back to how he had once dismissed her as nothing more than a figurehead, and he felt a pang of regret. But that regret was quickly replaced by gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons she had taught him, for the opportunities she had given him, and for the example she had set. After the meeting, Dan approached Emma as she reviewed some notes at the podium. "Emma," he began, his tone thoughtful, "do you ever feel restless? Like there's more you're supposed to be doing?" She looked up, intrigued by the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I've learned to focus on what's in front of me." "Why do you ask?" Dan hesitated, then sighed. "I've been thinking a lot about my own purpose, what I want my legacy to be. And I feel like there's something more I'm meant to do. I just don't know what it is yet." Emma studied him for a moment, then smiled. "It sounds like you're ready for the next chapter." "The next chapter?" he echoed. "Yes," she said. "You've grown so much here, Dan. You've made a real impact. But maybe it's time to think about how you can take that growth and apply it in new ways." Dan nodded slowly, her words resonating deeply. "Maybe you're right." Over the following months, Dan began exploring new opportunities to expand his impact beyond the company. He partnered with local organizations to mentor young professionals, spoke at community events about the importance of inclusion and leadership, and even started writing a series of articles about his journey. The articles, published on a prominent business platform, quickly gained traction, sparking conversations about the importance of humility, growth, and collaboration in leadership. One evening, as he worked on his latest piece, Dan received an email from a young entrepreneur named Lila. She explained that she had read his articles and felt inspired to reach out. She was in the early stages of building her own tech startup and wanted his advice on navigating the challenges she faced as a young woman in a male-dominated industry. Dan was deeply moved by her message and immediately responded, offering to meet with her. They scheduled a coffee meeting for the following week, and when the day arrived, Dan was struck by Lila's passion and determination. She reminded him of Emma in many ways, driven, resourceful, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. "You have a great vision," Dan told her as they discussed her business plan. "And you're already ahead of where I was when I started out. The key is to stay true to your values, even when things get tough." Lila nodded, soaking in his advice. Thank you, Dan. It means a lot to hear that from someone with your experience. As he watched her leave, Dan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He realized that helping others succeed brought him a sense of fulfillment that no deal, promotion, or accolade ever could. Meanwhile, at the company, Emma was planning her next big initiative. Inspired by Dan's growth and the impact of the mentorship program, she wanted to launch a leadership academy designed to empower professionals at all levels of their careers. The academy would focus on fostering emotional intelligence, ethical decision-making, and inclusive leadership, a reflection of the values that had guided her journey. Dan, Emma said one afternoon as they reviewed the proposal, I want you to lead this academy. Dan's eyes widened. Me? Are you sure? Yes, she said firmly. You've lived this transformation. You've shown what's possible when someone is willing to grow. Who better to guide others through that journey? Dan felt a mix of pride and apprehension. It's a big responsibility. I know, Emma said with a smile. But I believe in you. And I think you're ready. The launch of the Leadership Academy was a resounding success. Participants from across the company and beyond signed up to learn from Dan's insights and experiences. The program quickly became a cornerstone of the company's culture, earning praise from industry leaders and media outlets alike. For Dan, the academy became a place where he could channel everything he had learned, both the mistakes and the triumphs, into something meaningful. He shared stories of his early arrogance, his missteps, and the lessons Emma had taught him. And in doing so, he inspired others to reflect on their own journeys and strive for growth. One day, after a particularly engaging workshop, Emma stopped by Dan's office. How does it feel? She asked, leaning against the doorframe. Dan looked up, a satisfied smile on his face. Feels like this is what I was meant to do. She nodded, her own smile reflecting her pride. You've come a long way, Dan. So have we, he replied. And I'm grateful for every step of the journey. As the years passed, Dan's legacy continued to grow. The Leadership Academy expanded, reaching professionals in industries around the world. The mentorship program flourished, producing a new generation of leaders who carried forward the values Emma and Dan had championed. And the company, under Emma's unwavering guidance, remained a beacon of innovation and inclusivity. But for Dan, the most rewarding part of the journey wasn't the accolades or the recognition. It was the people. It was the mentor who became mentors, the leaders who rose to new heights, and the colleagues who became friends. It was the realization that true success wasn't about climbing the ladder, it was about lifting others up as you climbed. One evening, as he sat in his home office, Dan received an email from Priya, the young analyst he had mentored years ago. She had just been promoted to a senior leadership role and wanted to thank him for believing in her. I wouldn't be here without you, she wrote. You taught me what it means to lead with integrity and heart. I hope I can do the same for others. Dan leaned back in his chair, a smile spreading across his face. In that moment, he knew he had found his purpose. And it was more fulfilling than anything he had ever imagined. As Dan reflected on the email from Priya, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of accomplishment, not for himself, but for the ripple effect his mentorship had created. He realized that every act of encouragement, every piece of advice, and every moment of belief in someone else had the power to change not just one life but countless others. And Priya was living proof of that. The next day at work, Dan approached Emma's office, a coffee cup in hand for her as a small gesture of gratitude. She looked up from her desk, smiling as he entered. Thanks, Dan, she said, taking the coffee. What brings you here? I just wanted to talk for a minute, he said, sitting across from her. It's about the academy and, well, everything. Emma leaned back, curious. Go on. I've been thinking a lot about the impact we've had, Dan began. The academy, the mentorship program, everything you've built here. It's incredible. But I keep asking myself, what's next? How do we make this even bigger? How do we reach more people? Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's a good question. Do you have an answer? Dan hesitated, then leaned forward. What if we took the academy global? Not just within our industry, but across sectors, nonprofits, startups, schools, governments. Leadership is universal, and the principles we teach can apply anywhere. Emma's eyes lit up. I like where you're going with this. But it's a big leap. How would you make it happen? Dan had anticipated the question and pulled out a folder of ideas he'd been working on. He laid it on the desk and began explaining his vision. Partnerships with international organizations, virtual workshops to reach remote areas, scholarships for underserved communities, and a global summit to bring leaders together. Emma listened intently, her respect for Dan growing with every word. When he finished, she leaned forward and said, "You've really thought this through." "I have," Dan admitted. "Because I believe in this. I believe in what we're doing. And I want to take it further." Emma smiled. "Then let's do it." With Emma's support, Dan began laying the groundwork for the global expansion of the Leadership Academy. He assembled a team of passionate individuals, each bringing unique skills and perspectives to the table. Together, they reached out to potential partners, designed new curriculum modules, and planned the first-ever Global Leadership Summit. The summit would be the culmination of their efforts, a 3-day event featuring keynote speakers, interactive workshops, and networking opportunities for leaders from all walks of life. The goal was to inspire collaboration and innovation on a global scale, breaking down barriers and fostering a shared vision for the future. As the months went by, the excitement around the summit grew. High-profile figures from business, education, government, and the arts signed on as speakers, and attendees from dozens of countries registered to participate. For Dan, it was both exhilarating and daunting. He knew this was the biggest challenge he had ever taken on, but he was determined to make it a success. The week before the summit, Dan found himself working late at the office, going over final details. As he reviewed the schedule for the event, Emma walked in, carrying a folder. "Still here?" she asked with a knowing smile. Dan looked up, chuckling. "You caught me. Just making sure everything's perfect?" Emma sat down across from him, setting the folder on the desk. "You've done an incredible job, Dan. I hope you know that." "Thanks," he said, his tone sincere. "But it wouldn't have happened without you. You gave me the chance to grow, to change. I'll never forget that." Emma's smile softened. "And you ran with that chance. That's what matters. You took what you learned and turned it into something bigger than yourself. That's leadership." Dan nodded, her words sinking in. "I just want this summit to be everything we've dreamed of." "It will be," Emma assured him. "And no matter what happens, remember this, you've already made a difference. The summit is just the beginning." The day of the summit arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The venue, a sprawling convention center in New York City, was buzzing with energy as attendees from around the world gathered to exchange ideas and build connections. The stage was set for an unforgettable event, with banners and displays showcasing the values of the Leadership Academy. Dan stood backstage, taking a moment to steady his nerves. He had been asked to deliver the opening address, a responsibility that both honored and terrified him. But as he looked out at the crowd, he reminded himself of why he was there. Emma joined him just before he went on, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got this," she said. "Just speak from the heart." Dan nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. The applause was deafening as he approached the podium, but he focused on the faces in the audience, the leaders, the dreamers, the changemakers who had come together for a common purpose. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "It's an honor to stand here today, surrounded by so many incredible people. This summit isn't just about leadership, it's about connection. It's about learning from one another, challenging ourselves, and working together to create a better future." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I'll be honest, if you had told me 10 years ago that I'd be standing here, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I thought leadership was about power, control, and ego. I thought success was something you achieved alone. But I was wrong. I've learned that real leadership is about humility. It's about lifting others up, listening to their stories, and recognizing that we're stronger together than we could ever be alone. And I learned that from the incredible people in this room." The audience erupted into applause, and Dan felt a surge of gratitude. As he continued his speech, he spoke about the values that had shaped the academy, the challenges they had overcome, and the vision they shared for the future. The summit was a resounding success. Attendees left feeling inspired and empowered, ready to take what they had learned back to their own communities. The connections forged during the event led to new collaborations, new ideas, and new possibilities. For Dan, the experience was transformative. He had found his purpose, not just as a leader, but as someone who could help others discover their own potential. And as he stood with Emma at the closing reception, watching the attendees mingle and celebrate, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "This is it," he said, turning to her. "This is what I've been searching for." Emma smiled, raising her glass in a toast. "To growth, to connection, and to the future." "To the future," Dan echoed, clinking his glass against hers. In the years that followed, the Global Leadership Academy continued to thrive, reaching people in every corner of the world. Dan became a sought-after speaker and mentor, dedicating his life to empowering others. And while he often reflected on his journey, he never forgot the woman who had set him on this path. Emma Caldwell remained at the helm of the company, her vision as strong as ever. Together, she and Dan had created something extraordinary, something that would endure for generations. And as they looked ahead, they knew one thing for certain: the best was yet to come. As the years passed, the Global Leadership Academy became one of the most influential initiatives in the world. Its reach extended far beyond what Dan and Emma had ever imagined. Governments began adopting the Academy's curriculum for training civil servants, corporations implemented its leadership models to foster inclusion and innovation, and educational institutions integrated its principles into their programs. Dan found himself busier than ever, traveling to countries he had only dreamed of visiting, speaking to audiences who hung on his every word. Despite the grueling schedule, he thrived. He knew that every hour he spent on the road, every workshop he facilitated, and every story he shared was contributing to something greater than himself. One of his most memorable trips was to a rural village in Kenya. The Leadership Academy had recently launched a partnership with a local nonprofit to train young women in entrepreneurship and community organizing. Dan was invited to meet the first cohort of graduates, and he eagerly accepted. The village was alive with excitement when Dan arrived. Children ran alongside the Jeep as it pulled up to the community center, their laughter filling the air. Inside, the graduates, dressed in brightly colored traditional attire, stood proudly, holding certificates and beaming with pride. Dan was introduced to the group by Amina, the program coordinator. "These young women," Amina said, "are not just leaders, they are pioneers. They've started businesses, organized health campaigns, and even negotiated with local officials to improve infrastructure. They are changing the face of this community." Dan was humbled as he listened to their stories. One young woman, Fatima, had started a small tailoring business that employed several women in her village. Another, Wanju, had organized a clean water initiative that brought safe drinking water to dozens of families. "These are the kinds of leaders the world needs," Dan said as he addressed the group. "You're not just changing your community, you're inspiring others to do the same. And that's how real change happens." After the ceremony, Fatima approached Dan with a shy smile. "Mr. Harris," she said, "I used to think leadership was only for people in big cities, people with power. But now I know it's for all of us. Thank you for showing us that." Dan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "No, Fatima. Thank you. You're the one making the difference." The experience in Kenya stayed with Dan long after he returned home. It reminded him of why he had embarked on this journey and renewed his commitment to expanding the Academy's reach. He shared the stories of Fatima, Wanjiru, and the other graduates in his speeches and articles, using them as examples of the transformative power of leadership. But as Dan poured himself into his work, he began to notice something he hadn't anticipated: a growing sense of loneliness. His days were filled with meetings, events, and travel, but his nights were often spent alone in hotel rooms, far from the people he cared about. One evening, after a long day of meetings in Singapore, Dan sat by the window of his hotel room, looking out at the city lights. He thought about his family, his friends, and the life he had left behind to pursue his purpose. For the first time in years, he wondered if he had sacrificed too much. The next morning, he called Emma. "Emma," he said as soon as she picked up, Do you ever feel like you've given up too much for this work? There was a pause on the other end. Sometimes, she admitted, but I try to focus on the impact we're making. Why do you ask? I don't know, Dan said, running a hand through his hair. I feel like I'm losing touch with the people in my life. I'm so focused on the academy that I don't have time for anything else. Emma's voice softened. Dan, what we're doing is important, but so is your well-being. You can't pour from an empty cup. Maybe it's time to take a step back and find some balance. Dan sighed. Maybe you're right, but how do I do that without feeling like I'm letting people down? By remembering that you're human, Emma said. You've given so much, Dan. It's okay to take care of yourself too. Emma's words stayed with Dan as he returned to work. He began making small changes, delegating more responsibilities, saying no to unnecessary engagements, and carving out time for his personal life. It wasn't easy, but he knew it was necessary. One weekend he visited his sister, whom he hadn't seen in months. As they sat in her backyard catching up, Dan realized how much he had missed being present for the people he loved. His niece and nephew ran around the yard, laughing and playing, and for the first time in a long time, Dan felt at peace. Uncle Dan, his nephew said, running up to him with a soccer ball. Can you play with us? Dan hesitated for only a moment before smiling. Of course I can. As Dan found a better balance between his work and personal life, he became an even more effective leader. He realized that taking care of himself allowed him to give more to others, and he began encouraging his team to do the same. The Leadership Academy continued to grow, with new programs launching in countries around the world. Dan and Emma worked closely to ensure the initiative remained true to its values, even as it expanded. Their partnership, built on mutual respect and trust, became a model for others to follow. Years later, at the Academy's 20th anniversary gala, Dan and Emma stood together on stage, looking out at a room filled with graduates, partners, and supporters. The event was a celebration of everything they had achieved, but it was also a reflection on the journey that had brought them there. Emma took the microphone first, her voice steady and full of emotion. 20 years ago, we started with a simple idea: to empower people to become leaders in their own lives and communities. Today, that idea has grown into a global movement, thanks to all of you. She turned to Dan, handing him the microphone. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. When I look around this room, I see the future, he said. I see leaders who are shaping their communities, changing industries, and inspiring others to do the same. And I'm reminded of something Emma once told me: leadership isn't about ego, it's about service. It's about lifting others up and creating opportunities for growth. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for letting me be part of this journey. It's been the greatest honor of my life. The room erupted into applause, and as Dan and Emma embraced, they knew they had created something extraordinary, something that would continue to inspire, empower, and transform for generations to come. As the applause filled the grand ballroom, Dan looked out at the sea of faces before him. It was a humbling moment, one that made him reflect on how far the Leadership Academy and his own journey had come. Yet even amidst the celebration, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to do. The world was evolving rapidly, and with it came new challenges: climate change, inequality, digital divides, and he knew the Academy had to evolve as well. After the gala, Emma found Dan standing by a window overlooking the city skyline. She approached him with a knowing smile. You're thinking about what's next, aren't you? Dan turned to her, chuckling softly. You know me too well. Emma crossed her arms. What's on your mind? Dan took a deep breath. I've been thinking about the impact we've had, how far we've come. But I also see how much more needs to be done. The Academy has focused so much on individual leadership, which is important, but what about collective leadership? What about tackling the big, systemic issues that no one person can solve alone? Emma nodded, intrigued. Go on. We've built something incredible, Dan continued, but I think we're ready for the next phase. A global network, teams of leaders working together across industries, borders, and cultures to address the world's most pressing problems. Not just teaching leadership, but mobilizing it. Emma's eyes sparkled with excitement. A coalition of changemakers, she said. I like it. Exactly, Dan said. We could create specialized task forces, groups focused on climate action, economic equity, technological ethics. Bring in experts, activists, innovators, and connect them with the skills and resources they need to make real change. Emma tapped her chin thoughtfully. It's ambitious. It is, Dan admitted. But if we've learned anything over the years, it's that ambition can lead to extraordinary things. Emma smiled. Then let's make it happen. Over the next several months, Dan and Emma worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They called the initiative Global Impact Network, a bold expansion of the Leadership Academy designed to harness the power of collaboration. The network would bring together leaders from diverse fields and backgrounds, fostering partnerships and incubating solutions for complex global challenges. The announcement of the Global Impact Network generated a wave of excitement and support. Governments, corporations, nonprofits, and academic institutions signed on as partners, eager to be part of a movement that promised to bridge divides and drive innovation. The inaugural Global Impact Summit was held in Geneva, chosen for its history as a hub of diplomacy and international cooperation. The event brought together hundreds of delegates, scientists, educators, entrepreneurs, policymakers, and community organizers, all united by a shared commitment to creating a better world. Dan and Emma opened the summit with a joint address, standing side by side on a stage adorned with flags from around the world. Today, Emma began, we take the next step in our journey. A journey that began with a simple idea, that leadership is not a privilege, but a responsibility. That true leaders don't seek power, they seek progress. Dan picked up where she left off. The challenges we face are too big for any one person, organization, or nation to solve alone. But together, we are unstoppable. Together, we can build a future defined not by fear, but by hope. Not by division, but by unity. The audience erupted into applause, and as Dan and Emma stepped off the stage, they felt the weight of the moment. They knew they had set something extraordinary in motion. One of the most impactful sessions of the summit was a panel discussion on climate change, featuring leaders from science, industry, and activism. Among them was Dr. Elena Torres, a renowned environmental scientist, and Amara Okoye, a young climate activist from Nigeria who had mobilized her community to combat deforestation. Dan moderated the discussion, asking each panelist to share their insights and ideas for collective action. Amara spoke passionately about the importance of grassroots movements, while Dr. Torres emphasized the need for systemic change and international cooperation. As the session drew to a close, Dan posed a final question: what gives you hope? Amara's response was simple but powerful. People, she said. When I see people coming together, sharing their stories, and fighting for what they believe in, I know change is possible. The room was silent for a moment, then burst into applause. The summit concluded with the formation of several task forces, each focused on a specific issue: climate resilience, education access, economic equity, and more. Delegates left Geneva energized and ready to take action, armed with new connections, ideas, and resources. For Dan and Emma, the summit was a validation of their vision. But they also knew it was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead, ensuring that the Global Impact Network lived up to its promise and delivered tangible results. Back at the office, Dan and Emma met with their core team to debrief and strategize. The energy in the room was palpable as they reviewed the outcomes of the summit and discussed next steps. We need to keep the momentum going, Emma said. The task forces are a great start, but they'll need ongoing support, funding, coordination, and visibility. And accountability, Dan added. We need to track their progress and share their successes with the world. Show people what's possible when we work together. The team brainstormed ways to sustain and scale the network, from launching a dedicated online platform for collaboration to hosting regional summits and workshops. It was ambitious, but they were determined to make it work. As the Global Impact Network gained traction, Dan found himself once again reflecting on his journey. He thought about the man he had been, the arrogance, the narrow-mindedness, the blind pursuit of success, and marveled at how much had changed. He thought about Emma, the woman who had challenged and inspired him, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. One evening, as they worked late in the office, Dan turned to Emma. "You know," he said, "none of this would have happened without you." Emma looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean all of it," Dan said. "The academy, the network, my own growth. It all started with you believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Emma smiled, her eyes softening. "You deserved it, Dan. You just needed someone to remind you of who you could be." Dan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you. Thank you," Emma replied, "for proving me right." As the years went on, the Global Impact Network continued to grow, tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges with creativity, collaboration, and determination. Dan and Emma remained at the forefront, their partnership a shining example of what was possible when people came together with a shared purpose. And while their journey was far from over, they took comfort in knowing that they had built something lasting, something that would continue to inspire and empower others for generations to come. Standing together at the Global Impact Network's 5-year anniversary celebration, Dan and Emma looked out at the crowd of leaders, innovators, and dreamers they had brought together. The world was still full of challenges, but it was also full of hope. "This," Dan said, raising his glass in a toast, "is what leadership looks like." Emma smiled, raising her own glass. "Here's to the impact we've made, and the impact yet to come." As the crowd erupted in cheers, Dan and Emma shared a look of quiet pride. They had come a long way, but they knew their greatest legacy was not in what they had achieved, but in the countless lives they had touched and the brighter future they had helped create.